Welcome to your cozy corner of calm. Here, you'll find gentle stories and the soothing sound of rain, created to help you unwind, ease your thoughts, and drift peacefully into sleep. If this space brings you comfort, consider subscribing so you'll always have a quiet place to return to. Now, make yourself comfortable, close your eyes, and let tonight's story carry you gently into rest. Title: The Whispering Willow Beneath the Golden Hues of a Fading Afternoon. The quiet town of Willowbrook rested in the embrace of endless rolling meadows. A narrow stream wound its way through the land, its waters murmuring gentle secrets to the willows that lined its banks. One such tree, an ancient willow with sweeping branches, stood taller and broader than the rest. It was known as the Whispering Willow. For generations, townsfolk believed the tree held the memories of all who had once rested beneath its shade. Some said its leaves rustled with voices of the past, telling stories only those who listened closely could hear. At the heart of Willowbrook, in a modest cottage with white shutters and a garden of wildflowers, lived Eleanor Reed. Eleanor was a woman of quiet grace, her hair silvered by time, her hands worn by years of tending to the land. Every evening, as the sun cast amber light across the fields, she would take her usual path to the Whispering Willow, her heart carrying both joy and sorrow. Eleanor, as husband, Samuel, had planted the willow when they first moved to Willowbrook. Together, they had watched it grow, just as they had watched their children take their first steps beneath its branches. And when Samuel passed, the tree became Eleanor's refuge, a place where she felt his presence inch the rustling leaves, where his memory lingered like the scent of the earth after rain. One crisp autumn evening, as she sat beneath the tree with a book resting on her lap, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "So you hear it, Mrs. Reed?" She turned to see a young boy, no older than 10, standing nearby. His name was Oliver, the baker's son. He had an inquisitive mind and eyes that reflected the sky after a storm, deep and filled with wonder. "Hear what, Oliver?" she asked gently. "The tree," he said, stepping closer. "It whispers." Iran smiled. "And what does it say to you?" Oliver hesitated, his small fingers tracing the veins of a fallen leaf. Would think he'd tell stories, but would not he understand them yet? Eleanor looked up at the swaying branches. "Perhaps," she said, "you meant to listen a little longer." From that evening on, Oliver often joined Eleanor beneath the Whispering Willow. She shared stories of the town's past, of Samuel's laughter, of summer days when the fields shimmered like gold. And as the season passed, Oliver grew to love the tree as deeply as Eleanor did. Years went by, and one winter morning, Willowbrook awoke to a willow stood silent. A whispering willow stood silent, its branches heavy with frost. Eleanor, now frail but still grateful, wrapped herself in a thick shawl and made her way to the tree one last time. As she sat beneath it, she closed her eyes and let the wind carry whispers of days gone by. She felt Samuel's warmth, heard the echo of children's laughter, and knew that the tree had gathered every story she had encountered there. Her hands folded peacefully in her lap. He did not cry. Instead, he sat beside her, listening to the wind through the branches. And from that day forward, whenever someone asked about the Whispering Willow, Oliver would smile and say, "It tells the stories of those who listen." Title: The Whispering Pines. On the outskirts of a quiet little town where rolling meadows stretched endlessly and a crystal clear river wound through fields of wildflowers, there stood a forest of towering pines. The townspeople called it Whispering Pines, for when the wind blew, the trees sang inch-soft, soothing voices among those who cherished the forest. Was an elderly man named Henry Whitmore. He had lived in the town for over 70 years, and every evening, without fail, he would take a slow walk through the woods. The scent of pine and earth, the rustling of leaves, and the gentle hum of nature had been his lifelong companions. One summer, a young woman named Clara moved to town. She had left behind the noise and haste of the city in search of peace. Though she hardly knew what peace would look like, she rented a small cottage near the forest, hoping that the quiet might help her rediscover a sense of belonging toward town. One evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the world in golden light, Clara ventured into Whispering Pines for the first time. She walked slowly, her fingers brushing the bark of the ancient trees, feeling the heartbeat of the forest beneath her feet. It was there she met Henry. He stood by a fallen log, gazing at the setting sun filtering through the leaves. His face, though weathered, carried a serene warmth. "Good evening," she greeted him softly. Henry turned and offered a kind smile. "Good evening, young lady. First time in the woods?" She nodded. "It's beautiful here. It feels alive." "It's alive," Henry replied. "The trees remember. They whisper the stories of those who have walked these paths before." Clara chuckled. "He want to know. And what stories do they tell you?" Henry gestured for her to sit on the log beside him. "They tell me of change, of how the river once ran wider, how the seasons have shifted, how the laughter of children used to echo through these trees more often." He looked at her thoughtfully. "And they tell me when someone carries a heavy heart?" Clara hesitated, then looked down at her hands. "Was suppose they rewrite. Mort came here to escape something, though Mort not sure what exactly." Henry nodded as if he understood completely. "Sometimes we don't need to name what burdens us. Sometimes we just need a place where we can set it down for a while." For many evenings after, Clara found herself returning to Whispering Pines. Henry taught her the language of the trees, the way the wind carried secrets, how the river hummed lullabies, and how, if one listened closely, nature itself could soothe the heart. As the weeks passed, Clara noticed a change within her. The ache that had weighed on her chest for so long began to fade. She no longer felt lost. She had found solace in the rhythm of the forest and in the quiet wisdom of an old man who had learned to listen to the world. One evening, when the leaves had started to turn golden and the air carried the first whispers of autumn, Clara asked Henry, "Do you ever feel lonely?" He smiled gently. "Not anymore. The trees have been my friends for longer than one can remember, and now try to navigate. So I'm a friend there walks among them." Clara smiled back, realizing in that moment that peace had found her, not in grand gestures or distant places, but in quiet conversations and steady presence of someone who understood. As she left the forest that night, the pines whispered softly, carrying the stories into the wind. And for the first time in a long while, Clara felt truly at home. The wind whispered softly through the towering pine trees, carrying the fresh scent of resin and damp earth. As twilight cast golden hues upon the sky, a small wooden cottage nestled by the edge of a tranquil lake. This was where Eleanor had lived for over 40 years, surrounded by the vast embrace of nature. Each morning, the warbling of songbirds greeted her, and in the evenings, gentle deer ventured to the grassy meadow just beyond her porch. Every night, before darkness fully settled, Eleanor would sit on her weathered wooden chair on the porch, gazing out at the still waters. She would sip her chamomile tea, letting its delicate warmth soothe her, and open an old, well-worn journal, a collection of memories spanning decades. Tonight, as the first stars emerged, she recalled a summer long past when her granddaughter, Clara, had come to stay. Clara was a city girl, always rushing from one task to another, her heart filled with ambitions and plans. But in this quiet retreat, she learned to slow down. She listened to the rustling of leaves, the rippling of water, and the sigh of the evening breeze, and she discovered that sometimes joy was not in chasing grand adventures, but in savoring the smallest, most delicate moments. Eleanor smiled as she remembered the afternoon they had rowed across the lake. Clara had trailed her fingers through the cool water, watching the ripples stretch outward. "Grandma," she had asked, her voice curious, "don't you ever feel lonely out here?" Eleanor had simply shaken her head. "Not at all, my dear. Here, would have the most wonderful companions. The sun greets me with golden light each morning. The wind dances around me, telling stories of distant places. And at night, the stars whisper ancient secrets as they shimmer above." Clara had laughed then, but later that night, by the crackling fire, she had sighed and admitted, "What thing would understand now? Everything here has meaning. Nothing rushes. Nothing is forced. It just beautifully." Eleanor placed her journal down, her gaze lingering on the moonlit surface of the lake. Clara was grown now, building a life in the bustling rhythm of the city. But Eleanor knew that deep within her, the lessons of that summer remained. The knowledge that peace could be found in a quiet night, a warm cup of tea, and a heart open to the world. As quiet wonders, the wind continued to weave through the pines. The lake murmurs softly against the shore, and the moon cast its silvery glow upon the world. Here, in this serene haven, time stood still, holding on to memories like whispers. In the night, the forest had always been a place of quiet magic, where time slowed, and the whispers of nature filled the air like a lullaby. Nestled at the edge of a vast woodland, a small cottage stood, its stone walls warmed by years of sunlight and stories. Here, Thomas had spent most of his life tending to his garden, listening to the rhythm of the seasons, and embracing the solitude that the forest offered him. Every morning, he would step outside with a cup of freshly brewed tea, watching the mist rise from the river that wound through the valley below. The trees, ancient and wise, stood tall, their leaves rustling gently in the morning breeze. Birds flitted from branch to branch, their songs weaving into the fabric of dawn. To Thomas, die Trace to Leia, Tune Doran. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves spiraled to the ground, a visitor arrived at his doorstep. It was a young woman named Lillian, a traveler who had lost her way while hiking through the hills. She looked weary, her backpack covered in dust, but her eyes held the same quiet admiration for nature that Thomas had carried in his heart for decades. "You must be tired," Thomas said with her inch, stepping aside to let her inch. "Come, rest for a while. The forest can be quite overwhelming if you were not familiar with its paths." Lillian accepted the offer gratefully. Inside, the cottage smelled of pine wood and cinnamon, a comforting scent that seemed to wrap around her like a soft blanket. She sipped on the warm tea he offered and gazed out the window, watching the late afternoon light dance upon the treetops. "What was looking for something," she admitted after a long pause, "but not sure what it is. What thought may be, if more wandered far enough. What defined it?" Thomas nodded, searching for something unnamed, something just beyond reach. He gestured toward the woods. "Sometimes the best way to find what you were looking for is to stop searching and simply listen." As evening settled in, the two sat on the porch, watching the fireflies flicker among the trees. The forest hummed with life, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures. In the underbrush, the soft murmur of the river below. Lillian closed her eyes, letting the sounds wash over her. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. When dawn arrived, she stood at the edge of the forest, ready to continue her journey. "Thank you, Thomas," she said softly, "for the tea, for the shelter, and for the quiet." Thomas simply smiled. "The forest will always be here, should you ever need to listen again." As they disappeared into the misty morning, Thomas returned to his garden, tending to the earth with the same gentle patience he had always known. The forest, with all its whispers and secrets, remained unchanged, and yet he knew in some small way it had once again touched a wandering soul, guiding her toward the peace she had been seeking all along. Title: The Lighthouse Keeper. As promised, beyond the rolling hills and meadows of a quiet seaside village stood an old lighthouse, perched upon the rugged cliffs of Blackwater Bay. It had been there for over a century, its beacon cutting through storms and fog, guiding lost sailors home. The lighthouse keeper, an elderly man named Thomas Reed, had tended to the beacon for nearly 40 years. He lived alone in a small cottage beside the tower, accompanied only by the sound of crashing waves and the cries of distant gulls. Despite his solitude, Thomas never felt lonely. He had the sea, the wind, and the lighthouse, a faithful companion that had never let him down. But there was one promise. It had made long ago, a promise that kept him waiting. One autumn afternoon, a golden light shimmered on the water. A young woman arrived in the village. Her name was Eleanor, and she had come in search of something she could not quite name. The villagers spoke of the lighthouse keeper, of his kindness, and the many years he had spent keeping the light burning. Intrigued, Eleanor made her way up the cliffside path, the salty breeze tangling her dark hair. She found Thomas sitting on a weathered bench near the lighthouse, gazing at the horizon as if expecting something or someone. "Good afternoon," Eleanor greeted him softly. Thomas turned, his deep-set eyes warm with quiet wisdom. Good afternoon, miss. What brings you up here? She hesitated before replying. Mort's, monsieur. Mort suppose Mort just needed to see the lighthouse up close. He nodded knowingly. The sea calls to those who are searching. Eleanor sat beside him, watching as waves roared endlessly toward the shore. Have you always lived here? Thomas chuckled. Almost. Mort came as a young man, took up the keeper's post, and never left. Why, his smile faded slightly, replaced by something distant. Because Maud made a promise. Eleanor glanced at him curiously, waiting for him to continue. Long ago, says. Friend, there was a sailor, my closest friend. We grew up in this village, dreaming of adventure. He set sail one autumn morning, promising to return before the first snowfall. Maud swore to keep the lighthouse burning until he did. Eleanor, as heart ached at the quiet weight of his words. Did he ever return? Thomas shook his head, gazing out at the endless blue. The sea is vast, and sometimes it keeps those it claims. But a promise is a promise. For a long while, neither spoke. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of salt and thyme. Eleanor returned to the lighthouse often after that day, listening to Thomas as stories of the sea, of storms weathered and ships saved. She found comfort in the steady rhythm of the waves, in the quiet presence of a man who had spent a lifetime waiting. One evening, as the sky burned with hues of crimson and gold, Eleanor asked, "Do you ever regret staying?" Thomas smiled, the lines on his face deepening. No, a promise kept is never wasted, and in the waiting would have seen beauty what might have otherwise missed. As autumn gave way to winter, Eleanor found herself drawn not just to the lighthouse, but to the quiet certainty it represented. She, too, had been searching for something, for meaning, for a place to belong, and perhaps she had found it here among the cliffs and the waves. The first snow fell one evening as the lighthouse. Thomas, wrapped in his old wool coat, stood at the railing, watching the sea as he always did. Eleanor stood beside him. He would have been proud, she whispered. Thomas nodded, his breath misting into the cold air. What things saw too. The sea stretched endlessly before them, the waves whispering stories only the patient could hear. And in the lighthouse, the beacon burned on, steadfast, unwavering, just as it always had title. The lantern emitted the mist. A thick mist clung into the valley, soft as a dream and silent a memory. It drifted through the trees, over the hills, and past the quiet cottages of Evermere, a village nestled deep within the heart of nature. At the edge of Evermere, where the cobble paths met the wide expanse of the moors, stood an old wooden lighthouse. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, though no one truly knew why. There was no sea for miles, only rolling hills and a river that shimmered under the moonlight. And yet, each night, a golden lantern flickered in its tower, cutting through the mist like a guiding star. The keeper of the light was a woman named Agnes Holloway. She was neither young nor old, neither sorrowful nor merry. She simply was. Her days were spent tending to the wildflowers that grew along the river bank, and her nights were spent keeping the lantern lit. Many in the village wondered why she did it. The lighthouse served no real purpose. And yet, without fail, the lantern glowed. Every night, some whispered that she was waiting for someone. Others believed she was guarding a secret. Only she knew. One evening, as the mist thickened and the river hummed its quiet song, a young traveler arrived in Evermere. His name was Elias. He carried only a satchel and the weight of a long journey. Curious about the mysterious light, he wandered toward the old lighthouse. He found Agnes sitting bent over, her hands resting gently in her lap. "You keep the lantern burning every night," Elias said. "Why?" Agnes studied the mist swirling over. "Because someone, somewhere, might need to see it," Elias frowned. "But there's no sea, no lost ships, no sailors looking for shore." She smiled, her eyes reflecting the golden glow of the lantern. "Not all who are lost sail the seas." Elias remained silent, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He had been wandering for so long, searching for something he could not name, and yet, in this quiet village, with the mist curling around his feet and the lantern shining through the night, he felt, for the first time, that he had arrived. The days passed, and Elias found himself returning to the lighthouse each evening. He and Agnes spoke of the stars, of the river, as whispered secret, of the unseen paths that led people home. One night, as he stood beneath the lantern, as golden glow, Elias realized he no longer felt lost. "Một understand now," he said softly. "The light, it is not for lost ships, it is for lost souls." Agnes nodded. "And you, Elias, have found your way as the years passed." The lantern never dimmed, and the mist continued to dance over that valley. And though many travelers came and went, there was always a light waiting for them. In the dark, the meadow stretched endlessly, a sea of golden grass, swaying gently in the autumn breeze. At its heart stood an old oak tree, its branches sprawling wide, offering shade and whispers of memories carried by the wind. Just beyond, nestled between the rolling hills, a small cottage stood, its walls covered in ivy, its windows reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. For as long as she could remember, Margaret had lived here, in this quiet haven where time seemed to move at a different pace. She had inherited the cottage from her grandmother, who had once told her that the land held stories if only one cared to listen. And listen Margaret did, every morning as the dew glistened on the grass, and every evening as the stars blanketed the sky. One late afternoon, as she sat by the oak tree with a book resting on her lap, she heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Turning, she saw a traveler, an elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes, making his way through the meadow. He carried a small satchel and walked with the careful steps of someone who had seen many roads. "Good evening," he greeted with a gentle nod. "Một am not intruding. Một used to pass through this meadow many years ago, and something drew me back." Margaret gestured to the open space beside her. "You welcome to rest here. The meadow has a way of calling people back." The man sat down, exhaling a soft sigh as he looked out at the golden waves of grass. "Một used to visit this place when Một was a boy," he said. "My parents would bring me here on long summer afternoons. Một remember the sound of the wind through the oak, as leaves, and the scent of white flowers in the air." Margaret smiled, knowing that the land had a way of holding onto memories, weaving them into the very fabric of the earth. "It's strange, she mused, how a place can remember us, even when we've been away for so long. The man nodded. Most suppose places like this, no matter how far we travel, some part of our heart remains here, waiting for us to return. As the evening deepened, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rustling of the grass and the distant call of a night bird. When the man finally stood to leave, he turned to Margaret with a grateful smile. "Thank you for sharing this moment with me. Maud had forgotten how much Maud missed this place." Margaret watched as he disappeared into the twilight, his figure blending into the shadows of the hills. She knew he would return, just as others had before him, drawn back by the quiet magic of the meadow. And so, the meadow remained a keeper of time and memories, whispering its gentle secrets to those willing to listen. In a quiet countryside, where golden fields stretched beyond the horizon, there stood an ancient willow tree by the edge of a tranquil pond. Its branches, long and sweeping, draped over the water as surface like a protective curtain, swaying gently with the breeze. This tree had been there for generations, its roots deep and strong, holding secrets of the many souls who had sought solace beneath its shade. Not far from the willow, in a quaint cottage with blue shutters and a garden full of wild flowers, lived a woman named Margaret. She was a bookbinder, known in the village for her delicate hands and keen eye for restoring or forgotten pages. Her days were spent surrounded by the scent of ink and parchment, stitching together stories that had once been lost to time. But when the sun began to set, she would close her shop and wander to the willow tree, where she would sit by the pond and listen to the whispering leaves. One summer evening, as Margaret settled into her usual spot, she noticed a young man sitting beneath the tree, sketching in a leather-bound notebook. He had an air of quiet concentration, his fingers smudged with charcoal. Curious, she approached and peered over his shoulder. His drawing was of the willow itself, every detail captured with remarkable precision. The way its leaves cascaded like a waterfall, the reflection in the rippling pond, the soft glow of fireflies beginning to wake. That's beautiful," Margaret said softly, not wanting to startle him. The young man looked up, his hazel eyes warm and kind. "Thank you, Maud. We've been coming here every evening, trying to capture how the light changes through the branches. It never looks the same twice." Margaret smiled and sat beside him. "It's a special tree. My mother used to bring me here when I was a child. She said how the willow listens to those who have stories to share." The young man nodded, tucking his charcoal away. "Maybe that's why Maud keep coming back." He extended his hand. "Maud, I'm Henry. Maud moved to the village a few weeks ago." As the summer stretched on, Margaret and Henry often found themselves under the willow, exchanging stories, some real, some imagined. Margaret spoke of the books she restored, the handwritten letters she had found tucked between pages, the mystery left behind by those who had owned them. Henry, an illustrator by trade, shared tales of the places he had visited, the people he had met, and the fleeting moments he wished he could keep forever in his sketches. One evening, as autumn painted the fields in shades of amber and crimson, Henry handed Margaret a book bound in soft, worn leather. "What made this for you?" he said. "It is filled with drawings of the will, the pond, the sunsets, our little corner of the world. Margaret ran her fingers over the pages, her heart swelling with gratitude. As winter approached, the willow shed its golden leaves, but Margaret and Henry continued to meet beneath its branches, wrapped in scarves and laughter. The villagers often saw them walking together, lost in conversation, their bond growing like the roots of the ancient tree. Years later, long after their hair had turned silver, the village children would find them still sitting beneath the willow, hand in hand, their stories forever entwined with the whispers of the leaves. Deep in the heart of a golden autumn forest, nestled between towering maple trees, stood a small wooden cabin. It belonged to an elderly woman named Margaret, who had lived there for as long as anyone in the nearby village could remember. Her home was a place of warmth, filled with the scent of cinnamon, dried herbs, and old books, where the fire always crackled softly in the stone hearth. Margaret was a quiet soul, content with the rhythm of the seasons. She spent her mornings gathering firewood, brewing spiced tea, and watching the mist rise from the valley below. She had once been a school teacher, guiding young minds through stories and lessons of the world, but when time slowed her steps, she found solace in the arms of nature. One crisp morning, as the leaves painted the forest floor in hues of amber and crimson, a visitor arrived at Margaret's doorstep. It was a young man named Daniel, a writer who had come to escape the noise of the city and find inspiration in the tranquility of the countryside. He had heard whispers in the village about the wise woman of the woods and hoped she might have a story to share. Margaret welcomed him with a warm smile, inviting him inside. She poured him a cup of tea, its steam carrying the scent of cloves and orange peel. "Tell me, young man," she said gently, "what brings you to this quiet corner of the world?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Well, suppose more message or something," he admitted. "A story, a truth, something was seen to have lost in the rush of life." Margaret nodded knowingly. "Ah, the world moves quickly, does it? Dear, time slows. If you stay long enough, you might find that what you seek has been within you all along." Over the days that followed, Daniel found himself captivated by the simplicity of life in the forest. He would rise early to watch the morning sun filter through the trees, listen to the rustling leaves as he walked along winding paths, and sit by the fire in the evening, listening to Margaret's gentle voice recounting stories of the past. One evening, as the wind carried whispers through the branches, Daniel asked, "Don't you ever miss the world beyond these trees?" Margaret gazed at the flickering flames, her eyes reflecting memories of years gone by. "The world is not something we leave behind here. It lies within us, in the stories we carry, in the moments we choose to remember." Her words settled deep in Daniel's heart. He realized that inspiration wasn't something to be chased. It was something to be felt, something that lived in the quiet spaces between each breath. As the days passed, his notebook filled with words once lost to him, and in the stillness of the forest, he rediscovered his own voice. When the time came for him to leave, he stood at Margaret's doorstep, hesitating. "Thank you," he said softly, "for reminding me to listen to the world, to the wind, to myself." Margaret simply smiled. The forest will always be here, and so will always be here, and so will its stories. Carry on with you. As Daniel walked away, the autumn leaves swirled around him, whispering secrets of the earth. He knew then that he would never truly leave this place, for it had become a part of him, woven into his words, into his heart, like an old story waiting to be told. Title: The Meadow. As secret there was a meadow on the outskirts of Ashwood Village, hidden between the rolling hills and the thick whispering forests. To those who happened upon it, the place seemed almost enchanted. Wildflowers of every color swayed gently in the breeze, and a quiet stream wove through the grass like a silver ribbon. The air was always filled with the soft hum of bees and the distant chirping of crickets, as if the meadow were singing a song only nature could hear. Few people ventured there, except for an old woman named Margaret. She had lived in Ashwood for as long as anyone could remember, and every afternoon, just as the sun beat too deep, she would make her way to the meadow with a small wooden basket in hand. Some villagers whispered about her, curious as to why she spent so much time in that secluded place. Perhaps she is searching for something, they said. Others simply shook their heads. She has always been that way, quiet, gentle, unworldly. One summer evening, a young boy named Oliver decided to follow her. He had seen her disappear into the tall grass many times before, and curiosity got the better of him. Staying a few steps behind, he watched as Margaret knelt by a patch of wild violets and began to hum softly, her fingers brushing against the petals with careful reverence. "What are you doing?" Oliver finally asked, stepping forward. Margaret turned, a faint smile on her lips. "Listening," she replied simply. "Listening to what?" "The meadow," she said, patting the ground beside her. "Come, sit with me, and you'll hear it too." Oliver hesitated, but eventually settled into the grass. The air smelled of earth and flowers, and the warmth of the fading sun wrapped around them like a soft embrace. "Close your eyes," Margaret instructed. "Now, tell me what you hear." Oliver listened. At first, he noticed only the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. But as he sat still, other sounds emerged: the bubbling of the stream, the fluttering wings of a butterfly, even the faint crackling of dry grass as a beetle crawled past. "Would hear the wind," he said, "and the water, and the bugs." Margaret nodded. "The meadow has a voice, just like you and Mott. It carries some old, some new, and if you listen long enough, it might just share a secret or two." Oliver frowned. "Secrets? What kind of secrets?" Margaret, S.K. softened. "The kind that remind you of things you've forgotten. The kind that make you feel at home." For weeks after that evening, Oliver returned to the meadow. Sometimes Margaret would be there, sitting quietly among the flowers, and sometimes he would find himself alone, listening, waiting, hoping to understand the secrets she spoke of. One day, as the first hints of autumn painted the leaves inch gold and crimson, Margaret handed Oliver a small, folded note. "It's time for me to go," she said. Oliver's heart sank. "Go where?" She smiled gently. "Somewhere. The wind calls me." As she walked away, Oliver unfolded the note. The words were written in delicate, flowing script. "Remembers everyone who has ever loved it. And now, it will remember you too." Years passed, and Oliver grew from a curious child into a thoughtful young man. But no matter how much time slipped away, he never forgot the meadow or the woman who had taught him how to listen. And on quiet afternoons, when the wind whispered through the grass, he would sit among the flowers, close his eyes, and remember Tidal, the song of the river. They've always been a mystery. It wound through the valley like a silver ribbon, its waters whispering secrets only the trees could understand. Some said if you listened closely enough, you could hear a song carried on the current, a melody so soft, so gentle, as the heart of the valley. In a small stone cottage covered in ivy lived Margaret Sinclair. She was a woman of quiet habits, known for her love of books, her well-tended garden, and the way she always left her windows open, as if waiting for something unseen to drift inside. Every evening, as the sky golden, Margaret walked to the river edge and sat upon the same smooth stone she had claimed as her own since childhood. She would close her eyes, let the breeze caress her skin, and listen. The water murmured, the leaves rustled, and in between those sounds was the song, the same melody she had heard since she was a girl. But she was the only one who seemed to hear it. The villagers of all the woods spoke of the river's beauty, its clarity, its ever-changing moods. But whenever Margaret asked if they heard the song, they would shake their heads and smile kindly, as though indulging a dreamer. Then one autumn afternoon, as she sat by the river, she was joined by someone new. Would hear it too, the voice said. Margaret turned to see a man standing a few feet away. His hair was gray at the temples, his eyes the color of stormy seas. He carried himself like someone who had traveled far and had finally found a place to rest. You hear the song? She asked, disbelief and hope intertwining in her voice. He nodded. Mutve heard it sing what was a boy, but Mut thought Mut was the only one. His name was Thomas, a wanderer who had spent his life searching for something he could not name. He had heard the river's melody as a child, but had lost it somewhere along the way, buried beneath the noise of the world. And now, this quiet found him again. For the first time in years, Margaret felt understood. They spent their evenings by the river, speaking in hushed voices, as if afraid to disturb the melody that wove through the air. As the days passed, the song seemed to grow stronger, richer, filled with harmonies neither of them had noticed before. It was never just a song, Thomas murmured one evening. It's a call, a reminder of something we always known but forgotten. Margaret nodded. A reminder that we belong. And so, as the seasons turned and the river flowed, the two of them remained, listening, remembering, and knowing that, at last, they had found their way home.